My name is Mary Chevreau. I'm the CEO with the Kitchener Public Library, and I'm just honored to be here today with you for yet another 85 Queen, this time an afternoon with Rob Rice, and it's going to be quite spectacular. I think that you're in for a real treat. Rob is an author and journalist, First Nation, on the shores of Georgian Bay in the southwest of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. His previous books include independent publishers' book award-winning short story collection, Moon Knight Sweat Lodge, and his debut novel, Legacy, and the national bestseller novel, Moon on the Crusted Snow. As a journalist, he spent most of his career reporting for the CBC News, and in 2014, he received the Anishinaabe Nation's Diwabin Citation for Excellence in the first national storytelling from 2018 to 2020 that he hosted Up North, CBC's afternoon show for Northern Ontario. As I mentioned, Rob first came to Kitchener Public Library in 2019 as part of a panel discussion for FOLD, the Festival of Literary Diversity, and we welcomed him back virtually 2020 when The Moon of Crusted Snow was our one book, one community read. We're so excited and welcome him back again today. Yeah, that's true. We could do it. Moon on the Crusted Snow told a post-urban story of a northern Anishinaabe community facing dwindling resources and the collapse of society from an Indigenous perspective. His latest novel, widely anticipated sequel, Moon of the Turning Leaves, this one, was released just last week. And since that release, just last week, in terms of the top, I just have a printout of the top lists for most of our media outlets. Moon of the Turning Leaves is number 2, pretty much across the board, both for Canadian fiction as well as original fiction, already number 2. And, of course, Moon on the Crusted Snow is back on the top 10 list as well. So congratulations for that. We're delighted that you took the time and found some time to meet with us today. I know you're very busy. You are much in demand across the country, and I know we're just one stop, early stop on your tour, and wish you all the best as you travel across the country. Also joining us this afternoon is Judith Pereira. Hello. Judith is the arts and book editor for the Globe and Mail. Most of you will know her through the Globe. She joined the Globe and Mail in 2001 as an intern with the Report on Business magazine while doing her master's degree in publishing. After a stint as a features editor for the globeandmail.com, she spent nearly 2 decades as the editor of the magazine, where she won several national newspaper awards. Congratulations for that. Judith has recently interviewed authors on stage for the Toronto Festival of Authors and Eden Mills Festival, and most recently here on stage with Charlotte Gray. We are thrilled to welcome her back to the stage today as well. Welcome, Judith. And without further ado, I'd like to invite both of you to the stage, and we're looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Miigwech Mary, thank you very much. Bonjour, Wabgijing Dijnikas, Makwat Ndodem, Wasasing Ndonjaba, Anishinaabe Minwa Jagana. Hi, everybody. I'm Wabgijik. I'm a member of the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe of Wasaksing First Nation. I'm of Anishinaabe and Canadian descent. That just basically means my dad's from the res, my mom's from town. And I'm just really delighted, really honored to be here today. Very nice to return to Kitchener. Just a beautiful library, wonderful staff, and I feel at home. And I'm just very thankful for you all for coming out on a Saturday afternoon. This is pretty cool. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with Judith. I've worked together with her, doing articles and stuff in the past, and we're looking forward to jumping into the book. And to get things started, I'll read a short passage from Moon of the Turning Leaves. Just a little bit from chapter 1. The story starts with a prologue where we see the birth of a little girl. And in chapter 1, we're reintroduced to the character of Nangos. She is a little girl in Moon of the Crusted Snow, and now she's a teenager, a community leader in her own right, and she's about to embark on a pretty major quest. So this is an intro to Nangos, and then I'll sit down with Judith and we'll have a chat. 2 days had passed since Wawaskune was born, and Nangos had proudly taken on the responsibility of harvesting the food for the feast to celebrate her niece's arrival. On short notice, she had decided that netting fish in the lake was the best option for a quick return. But it had only been a couple of weeks since the last netting, and she worried the lake stock was running low. A lot of the fish caught so far this season had seemed undergrown, and she'd heard similar complaints from other fishers. The 10 13-footers she'd rode out and rocked as she hauled in the net, but she kept her hips loose to prevent it from tipping. Since the age of 5, Nangos had practically lived on this lake, splashing along the shore with her brother, Mayingan, and other kids, rowing out to other inlets to explore, and walking along the ice and cutting holes to fish in the winter. The lake lay just steps from their settlement, which they called Shkidinakiwen, or New Village. It was wide and deep and teeming with fish when they first arrived, and her people called it simply Zagagan, the word for lake in their language. From the middle, rocky and sandy shores were visible in every direction, illuminated by the sun, which had cleared the tree line in the east. Nangos looked north, back at the settlement. When she and her family had made this land their new home, a half-day's walk from the crumbling homes and buildings of the old reserve, they had laid out their new community in a loose circle. The open space in the middle was kept clear for ceremonies, celebrations, and the play of children. Over the water, Nangos could hear the chatter of little ones in the distance as the community awoke just beyond the shore. The lodges lining that central space were inhabited by the 5 extended families who first came to Shkidinakiwen, led by Nangos' father, Evan Whitesky. She could see her own family's pair of domed dwellings, made of a frame of tied saplings and covered in canvas and plastic tarps, lying closer to the shore, on the outskirts of a permanent camp of 10 more wooden lodges ranged around the central gathering hub. The ceremonial lodge was the largest structure, standing about a meter taller than the other buildings, and easily within Nangos' line of sight from her vantage out on the lake. Like most other buildings in this community, it was shaped into a dome, stretched out on the ground like an elongated oval. Walter, the eldest survivor, had instructed Evan and the other younger adults to build it this way, in the manner of the old medicine lodges of the Nishnabek. To Nangos, Shkidinakiwen was physical evidence that separated the time before, what they called the Jibwa, from the world she knew now and that made up most of her memories. When her parents and their people were building this village, they erected an extra 2 dwellings on the periphery, in case any holdouts hoping for the lights to come back on at the old reserve, named Gowandagong for the abundant white spruce trees there, would eventually turn up, needing shelter. Like her Uncle Chuck, her mother's cousin, who at first refused to live in the bush. And Dave, the elder Walter's nephew, who remained in the community garage at the old site for as long as he could, half believing the machinery there, the power transformers and trucks, would one day work again. Nangos remembered those 2, among a handful of others, trudging through the snow, cheeks gaunt, eyes bloodshot, to join them after most of the holdouts had died off. The final few floats that buoyed the net thudded against the gunwale as Nangos brought in the last of it. 5 more fish, all notably smaller than usual at this point in the season. There were 13 altogether in the heavy green bin. A few twitched in their final nervous throes of life, but most had died shortly after being caught in the white weaves of the net, unable to move and push water through their gills. Nangos sighed and looked back to the shore. Adults were beginning to bustle in the central glade and along the shore, some collecting firewood, others hauling water in buckets. Most of the plastic tarps and canvas coverings of the dwellings were being readjusted or removed in preparation for the coming summer heat. Seeing people out now for daily tasks turned her attention back to the head count for tonight's feast. After everyone ate, the rest of the morning's catch would likely last her family a week at most. A loon flapped its wings low to the water as it passed through her line of sight. She grabbed the handles of the long, light aluminum oars, the oarlocks creaking and rattling as she settled into place to row homeward. As she pumped her right hand to slice the oar's blade through the water and point the bow to shore, the outlines of the muscles in her arms stretched and constricted in a steady tempo as she paddled herself smoothly to land. The bow came to a stop on the muddy shore, scraping loudly as the hull dug deep into the rocks below. With the boat firmly planted among the lush green reeds of the shoreline, Nangos stood, turned, and climbed up onto the seat in front of her and made her way to the front. The metal benches had captured the heat of the morning sun and warmed the bare soles of her feet. She leaped over the side and splashed into the shallow, cold water, which came up to her calves. The summer solstice was approaching, but the lake would remain fairly chilly until the peak of the summer heat. Nungos walked around to the bow and began to tug the boat out of the water and up onto the shore. "Need help?" A familiar voice murmured from behind. She turned to see her father walking down the grassy slope to the shore. Evan Whitesky's hair was freshly tied into a braid, and the sun reflected off the sheen of his black crown. He raised his hand to shield his eyes from the glare coming off the water. "Kawin," replied Nungos. "It's not that heavy this morning, sorry to say." She pulled the boat up into the grass and let it sit. Evan came to her side, and they peered down into the bin of fish, shoulder to shoulder. "If I caught those with a hook, I would have thrown them back," said Nungos. "But they got caught in the net, so most of them were already dead." "We'll make use of them," Evan said reassuringly. "Might be time to find better fishing spots," she suggested after a short pause. "Let's just clean these for now," her father replied, pulling the bin of fish out of the tin boat and turning to walk back up the slope. Nungos followed, carrying the other empty bin and the tattered nylon net. They ambled up from the shore and onto a plateau where their family's 2 domed lodges stood, each entrance facing a large central fire pit. The larger structure to the west was draped in green canvas tarps, faded by sunlight but mostly intact. A slightly smaller lodge was covered in a shiny, crinkled blue plastic tarp that rustled with any movement. The greenhouse stood tall enough for full-grown adults to walk around in upright with sufficient head space. The blue dwelling stood lower, primarily a sleeping space and a separate home for Nungos' brother, Maingan, and his partner Piche, and now their newborn, Wawaskone. Evan carefully placed the haul of fish on the grass in front of the fire pit. Nungos tossed the big plastic bin and white net aside as they each took a seat on one of the stools arranged around the pit. The morning sun climbed higher, and the soft humidity from the lake began to beat on their sun-darkened foreheads and bare shoulders. "Apish Ngashe?" Nungos asked, not seeing her mother around. "She went out to the garden earlier to get some stuff to cook with these gigonyik. Then I think she was going to go see her aunties for a little visit," Evan said. "I think a bunch of them are going to come by. They all want to see your little shimis." "Where's the rest of them then?" asked Nungos. "Inside sleeping still pretty tired from it all." She wanted to see the baby girl again, but didn't want to disturb the new parents. They sat in the comfortable late spring stillness. The sun climbed higher, accentuating their arid surroundings after several days without rain. The flies would descend upon them soon to feast on bare arms and legs, and they could only cover them up with long sleeves and pants or swat them away until the wood smoke from the evening fires provided a shield. Evan set to cleaning the fish and Nungos to mending the net, which they both agreed could use some work. She grabbed a handful of the fine mesh from the bin and pulled it up to eye level. The nylon threads, keeping the net together, were still strong enough to trap with, but scanning it up and down, she noticed some dire holes. It was their last net of this kind. "High ties won't work for a net," Evan reminded her. "They'll just soak and get loose and fall off. Maybe some spruce roots would work." Within her short lifetime, they would have been able to buy new nets hewn from thin but sturdy nylon strands from the people in the towns and cities to the south. Food and tools would come to them by air. In the winter, provisions came up on trucks that rolled along the ice. But her father rarely indulged her questions about things like airplanes, trucks, and satellites, and Nungos had mostly given up asking. The words and markings on their older tools and clothing, the things they hadn't made themselves, had become increasingly intangible to her. Now it seemed that almost everything that had come from Jiaonong, from the south, that other world, down there, was fading away and falling apart. She had been 3 when the power went out, and only 5 when her father had led their people off the old res and into the bush. But Nungos held on to fading memories of bright lights and soft furniture and rumbling cars and trucks that once took them from place to place. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you for that. Wab and I were talking before this, and I thought we would start with sort of oral storytelling. Let's start at the very beginning. Why not? And the way, surprisingly, Indigenous stories have been around here in this land for a long time. We just, are seeing some of this right now. In the North, I'm fascinated by the idea that there's sometimes a non-linear way of communities telling stories and how the land becomes a part of these stories. How did this influence you in your thinking with Moon of Crusted Snow, but also Moon of Turning Leaves? There's a lot of the land right there, just in what you read to us. Can you talk to me a little bit about how much the land, the communities, and storytelling in communities have influenced your stories?
Yeah, a lot. I grew up in a time in the 80s when our community, a lot of people in our community were working hard to reconnect with culture, to bring a lot of those stories back, to bring the drums back in ceremonies and so on. And of course, oral storytelling was a big part of that. You know, that explained everything that was being revived in our community. You know, there were stories about the drum. There are stories about why the birch bark has those lateral sort of markings on it. Stories about, you know, how lichen is formed on the rocks and so on, right? So there's something attached to basically everything in the tangible world around you. So when you're a little kid and you're seeing the world for the first time in many ways, you're hearing about the stories constantly, which is really an awesome way to, I think, engage with the world. And again, I was so fortunate that this was my upbringing, because there were generations previous to mine that were denied that or were brutalized because of it by the state, you know? So it's not just like the telling a story about, you know, how things were made around you or why certain things are the way they are. It becomes a part of every action. So when you're out there harvesting birch bark or sumac or dandelions or whatever, you know, the older person who's with you is telling you the story behind those things, what they do, how they came to be, and what you have to do with them in your community. So it's all very intentional, right? To have this sort of oral way of passing things down just embedded in everything that you do as an Anishinaabe person. So I think that's really the foundation of it all. And otherwise, you know, like, it was a big part of my schooling on the reserve. We always made time for elders to come in. That was prioritized over like lesson planning and stuff. So if you didn't like math class and like your Uncle Levi showed up and you got to put the math books away and hear an Anabush story or something like that. So yeah, you know, I was super fortunate to have that way of like learning of who I was, but also expressing myself essentially, and I think that's where that all begins. Should I tell the story about the article I wrote for you?
That's right. So Wab did this piece about oral storytelling. So and it's actually, I didn't realize that Moon of Turning Leaves sort of, you were doing that at the same time. So why don't we talk to me about what that was like?
Yeah. So Judith reached out to me a few months into the pandemic, and you're working on a series, I think, right?
I was looking at different ways of storytelling and how you use the land. People in the north, the Inuit, use it in a different way, and they use markers, and the land informs the pace of the story and the way this. So then I reached out to you to talk to you about your experiences with that. So it was part of a series the Globe did on storytelling.
It was all like the best timing for me to have this opportunity, because I had these old videotapes that a friend of mine from Parry Sound gave me of this elder named Fred Wheatley from Wasauksing, who was one of our key, I think, cultural figures in our community, especially during that time of reclamation and revival, like in the 80s and 90s, and even before that, obviously, too. But you know, this friend, Ray Pavlov, he used to invite Fred to these camping trips that he would organize for students from Wasauksing, the reserve, and Parry Sound, the town, right? And he'd invite Fred in to just tell stories about Anishinaabe ways, about history, and so on. And, you know, it was kind of like revolutionary if you think about it, that this happened in the 80s, way before anybody really knew what the word reconciliation was, you know? These sort of partnerships happened a lot where I'm from, and I'm very, very fortunate for that as well. But anyway, these tapes were just of Fred telling these students these stories. And because they're on VHS, it took me years to watch them, because who has a VHS player anymore, right? So it was later on in 2020, a few months into the pandemic, and I had time on my hands because I just quit working at CBC earlier that spring, and I was starting the process of planning this novel and really thinking about it. So I finally went to a guy in Sudbury and got these VHS tapes digitized. He put them like on a thumb drive for me. And I watched this tape, this 3-hour long storytelling session with Fred. And one of the things he noted, like he told all these stories about, why the trees why they come that close to the water, or which species, help out the other trees. All these really cool things about, land-based knowledge, eh? But one thing he mentioned later on is like, yeah, I know all these things because I speak them all the time. And I listen all the time. And that's part of who we are as Anishinaabe, because these things stayed alive for thousands of years prior to anything being recorded in any way. And that really helps you mentally, helps you spiritually to recite these things to other people all the time. And having just come out of my career as a journalist, I thought, all I've done over the last little while, like 20 years, is write things down, record them. Package them that way and, commit them to memory in that sense. And I thought, do I actually remember those things? And I didn't. There were a lot of things I'd forgotten just because I relied so much on recording things, on writing them. And then I wrote about that for Judith, and it sort of like cracked things open for me in developing this story.
That's amazing. I was talking with Sherry DeMalaine, who is another... If you do anything, pick up Marrow Thieves and read that book. I've bought it at least 7 or 8 times because I always give it away. And then I'm like, oh, right, I need to buy it again. But one of the things she talked about with oral storytelling is how it impacts your brain patterns and the way you think of stories and so I wonder if with Indigenous storytelling, if that's something, and then when you go to write it down, like what's that sort of like?
Oh yeah, like with this and the last books I wrote, I always wanted to like mentally have it in my brain. I wanted to be able to recite the whole story to somebody if I needed to, right, before I actually wrote it down. So at that point, when I saw that thing from Fred, I was like, okay, I'm going to just spend some time thinking about this story from start to finish. The imagery, the plot, the setting, everything. So that if somebody asked me, I'd be able to spend however many hours, just telling them this story, right? So that's really what I think just embedded it in my mind, and I think gave me the confidence to stay with the story, And of course, like I wasn't totally rigid with those things, some things changed in the writing process. But yeah, that's it has that memory foundation before actually engage in the act of writing it down.
That's actually really impressive. I don't know whether...
Well, there was a pandemic, so I had a lot of time on my hands too, right? Sitting at home, so...
So I'm just going to go from there to sort of, since I introduced Sherry, there's been a lot of, it's not new, a lot of BIPOC writers have sort of been funneled into this speculative fiction, horror, Stephen Graham Jones. I don't know whether you read his...
Yep.
Oh, my God, it's terrifying. But it's so good. Into this sort of horror, speculative fiction, science fiction. And I was wondering, is there not so much a reason for that, but is there sort of why the push into that, which is sort of Moon on Crested Snow kind of did that dystopian, even though it was a story about being on the res and being in a community situation. What's this urge to kind of push everybody into this idea that this is where you will live, in this box of speculative or horror?
I think that comes from like marketing departments at publishers. You got to put the book on the shelf somewhere, right? Like I went into writing Moon of the Crested Snow, like knowing that that's how it was going to be classified. Right? And I was totally fine with it because, I was inspired by a lot of post-apocalyptic literature in dreaming it up. And I read some post-apocalyptic literature when I was, researching and developing Moon of the Turning Leaves as well. But for me, I see it as a story about an Indigenous community, for sure, about Anishinaabe realities, first and foremost.
Well, in this book, one of the elders talks about we've already lived our apocalypse. And so I thought that was a really, really powerful and something that made me think about that a lot. And maybe that's why people like N.K. Jemisin and, Nala Hopkinson, they've always written in that it's like, we've already experienced this.
Yeah.
This horror is part of our lives.
Yeah, and that part in Moon of the Crested Snow is inspired by a conversation I had with my grandmother.
So it's real.
Yeah, it's real. Yeah, it's a real reminder. So Moon of the Crested Snow is mostly inspired by the blackout of 2003, which would have probably affected, I think, this area too, right? I was on the res when it happened, and although it was scary at first, I was there with my younger brothers, and as the day went on, we're like, oh, we're actually in the right spot for this because there's so many resourceful people around us, so to make a long story short. And I thought, oh, this would be really cool to write about someday. So that's basically how Moon of the Crested Snow came about. But about a year after the blackout, I was back home in my community. So I was about 25 at the time, and I was visiting with my grandmother. And, as media does, there was like all this anniversary coverage of the blackout from the year before coming, right? So I was sitting there with her, and I said, oh, Graham, that was pretty wild, that blackout, eh? I thought that was the end of the world. And she just kind of went, oh, end of the world, we've gone through that all kinds of times before, So we had this conversation where she, reminded me that it was her grandparents' generation that were originally displaced from the mainland, because our reserve is on an island. Wasauksing First Nation is an island, also called Perry Island. So after the Robinson-Huron Treaty was signed in 1850, it has vague language in it about where people are supposed to settle, right? And then Canada was confederated in 1867, and then the Department of Indian Affairs came into effect, and the Indian Act became law in 1876. So all these things combined, prompted the authorities, the settler authorities, to say, okay, you Indians living at the mouth of the Seguin River, where Parry Sound had already been established, you have to go out into this island, and that's just where you're going to live now. So that was my grandmother's grandparents' generation. So she said they would tell her stories when she was a little girl about that happening, and then looking back to the shoreline where Parry Sound was and seeing all the trees get cut down because forestry was the primary industry in Parry Sound, right? And it was devastating. They'd been removed from their homeland and they watched it be defaced, in real time. And then they weren't allowed to leave because the Indian Act forbade them from doing so. Children were abducted to go into residential schools. The Indian Act forbade ceremony and traditional practices, and drums were confiscated and destroyed. So it was the end of the world. And she said that to me, and I was like, yeah, geez, I knew all these things, but I didn't really put all that together. So there's a passage in Moon of the Crested Snow where Evan meets with one of the auntie figures, and she reminds him of that. So that's why I wanted to write about that. But the genre discussion more broadly is really interesting because, if you think about it, and this is not an original thought of mine, Cherie has said this a lot of times, that basically any Indigenous literature is post-apocalyptic because it's all about our realities living in what could objectively be considered a dystopia, right? So that's where that comes from. But I like to advance the discussion a little more, inspired by Daniel Heath Justice, who's a Cherokee author and scholar. He doesn't use the term speculative fiction from an Indigenous perspective. He calls them wonder works instead, because what Indigenous people and Black authors too, what they're doing is looking to the future beyond the existence of the state where we currently live, and pulling things from the past to create something different, something a little more positive and hopeful, to have that sovereignty and that desire to really be yourselves once again. So I like the term wonder works instead of speculative fiction.
I love that. I want to think more about that now, but we'll continue this discussion, and I'll put that thought away. What I found interesting about this book is if I was a librarian and or a publishing, I wouldn't call it speculative fiction at all. It's a quest, but it's very much. It's not. It's hopeful. Why did you decide to go that route in this book?
I think it was a lot of I see the first book being a story about a catastrophe, the immediate aftermath, and more or less the struggle between good and evil in that moment, but also with several themes around colonialism being woven into it, right? And really flipping that perspective of post-apocalyptic literature and putting Indigenous voices at the center of that, right? Rather than just seeing it as a story about destruction, there is an opportunity for renewal there. So with the second book, it's like, okay, I can further explore this world and maybe go a little deeper into how that renewal continues 10 years into the future, because this book takes place 10 years after the end of the first book. And just to see what has remained, what has been revived, what's been bolstered, and how these people live now, liberated essentially from the state, because the state doesn't exist anymore. So I see that as sort of a hopeful way to look at life. And, it sounds kind of morbid to hope for the end of the world, to like feel like yourself, or really revive your people as they fully should be. But there's a lot of hope there, but also like, again, this story came together in the first while of the pandemic, which was a really tough time for everybody, So it was like a refuge for me in some ways. It was really therapeutic to, it sounds weird, but it was really therapeutic to like dive into the end of the world and think about repairing things and putting them back together. And also, our second son was born right at the start of the pandemic, and our third son was born just this past January. So if you can't be hopeful for your own children, you're doing them a disservice. And I feel you're essentially disrespecting them, right, if you can't maintain that hope for them. So I think that's where it comes through in a more natural way too, and maybe a subconscious way at the same time.
So one of the things that I've heard is that this book also came about, you weren't really thinking about a sequel, but you came up with this sequel because readers kept asking you for a sequel.
Yeah.
Where does that come? Like, when do you just be like, okay, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to quit my job, and I'm going to do this? And but the readers, like, how does that work?
Well, initially when people would ask, it was shortly after the book came out, and I had not considered a sequel at all. I quite literally saw the characters as riding off into the sunset after the end of the first book, right? And then people would start asking me, and at first I said no because I was being honest, and then they'd be really bummed out when I would tell them that, right? So I thought, I gotta, fib a little bit, even if I'm not planning on it. So I'd start saying, I'm thinking about it. We'll see what happens. But you know what they say about telling yourself a lie so often, it eventually becomes the truth to you. I started thinking, maybe I should think of an idea. And then I partnered with my now agent, Denise Bukowski, after Moon Over the Crusted Snow came out. And she said, if you really put some thought into a good idea, I'm pretty sure I could find a home for it. And that's where the wheel started turning a little, I think, more efficiently. And I met with who became my editor, Rick Meyer, and Ann Collins, a publisher at Penguin Random House, for a lunch in Toronto about 4 years ago in November of 2019. And I just gave them my pitch, and then, it was all good. And in the months that followed, Rick and I would have these monthly check-ins. He'd be like, okay, where do you see the story going now? And, what role do you see this character playing? And, what's the landscape, et cetera, et cetera. So after a few months of these check-ins, he asked me to write like a little synopsis, couple pages. And after that, they offered me the contract. So, they offered to pay me, so that was the other big thing, to do it.
And did you know you were going to stop working at the CBC before that, or you had already stopped?
No, this was all happening in the background while I was still working at CBC. But when they offered me the contract in March of 2020, it was like pretty much the same week as the pandemic declaration. Which was all just so weird altogether. But then I knew, I was like, this is just not going to work. Like writing a whole novel. I was working as the afternoon show host for Northern Ontario, which hosting a radio show is a really intense job. It's like a 9-10 hour job a day, right? So I thought it's just not all going to work out, so I'll put in my notice here, and jumped off the mothership, as they say. So
it is the mothership. That's a big, giant, round thing. Just like let's talk a little bit about what the structure of this new book. It is a quest, in that kind of people get together and they're moving. But the protagonist in this one is very different. You decided to go with a young, there's a group there, but also tell it from the perspective of a young woman. Can you tell me a little bit about why you made that decision and what does that involve?
Yeah, great question. When I decided to put it that far in the future, the main reason was to put the focus on the younger generation from the first book, because that's really going to, I think, advance not just the sentiment of hope, but, that rebuilding or renewal sort of idea that just begins in the first one. And that's going to provide, I think, the freshest and most interesting perspective on this world, right? That was my idea. So I always had Mayingun and Nungos in mind. They're going to be central to the story somehow. And Evan's going to be there too, and it's going to be this quest. What's happened is, they go off from their old res into this new settlement they create, but they stay there for so long that the resources around them are starting to dwindle, right? And they realize that, our people historically didn't do this. They were migratory, they respected the land by not using it up in one place for so long. They'd move from place to place. So they have that revelation in the story, and then they also decide, well, they've had failed attempts to investigate what's happened after the blackout, but they've never really gone too far, and they decide, okay, maybe it's time to go farther south to see what's happened. But also, if you've read the first book, you'll remember that they're originally displaced from the north shore of Lake Huron to the south, up to far northern Ontario, which is what happened to several Indigenous communities across Canada through the process of displacement, colonialism in general, right? So that was the main plot, I guess. And I thought, okay, Evan's going to be part on this quest, and a couple of the other characters from the first book, and one of his kids should be on it too. And I think the trope is to make it a father-son story, a buddy story, right? But we've seen that so often, The Road is one book like that, Yeah. It's a quest at the end of the world kind of story with a father and a son. So I decided I didn't want to do that. I gave Mayingun another role, which is as a new dad. His daughter's born, so he has to stay home. So Nungos goes on this quest, the daughter, who's a little bit younger than Mayingun. And she's already, at this point, an expert hunter. She's got supreme bush skills. She's well-suited to go on this journey. So, yeah, it was, important for me to provide, a female protagonist in some ways. And, as a dad to 3 boys, I thought it was my responsibility too, to show them, that, there are women heroes despite them all getting into Spider-Man and Batman and all that at this time, right? So, yeah, those are some of the reasons.
I love her. I would want her on my team. If there was an apocalypse, I'm like, please come and help me. So let's talk a little bit about just the book itself and we talked a little bit about the landscape. Talk to me about how you developed the actual scenes and the scene setting for it, because in the 10 years since this blackout happened, everything went to heck in a handbasket. You've got bush growing. They are not exactly sure where they are. How do they kind of navigate that? And how do you kind of pace that and kind of propel them, but also show what's happening in that little group?
Yeah, the pacing was the biggest challenge for sure. If you think about the first book, it's about a power outage on a res. People are just sitting around to see what happens. Sounds kind of boring, right? And then the second book is okay, after this blackout, they go walking through the bush for a couple months. Sounds kind of boring too, right? So yeah, what was more interesting to me was like this rediscovery of the land around them. Even though their connection with the land has helped them survive from the first story, there's still a lot more they need to do to venture out and to sort of make that reconnection, eh? So they plan this big quest south, which may take them a month. They're not totally sure. They have old maps, but in this time that they've been isolated, the land has changed a lot around them. And it's not mentioned in the story outright, but these are the sort of outcomes of climate change too. They have to deal with flooding, they have to deal with the aftermath of forest fires. but putting the lands like not just as a setting, but as like an active element to the plot.
It's almost a character.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think part of that was really important to just show the respect that they need to have for the land, because it's potentially perilous to them too, you know, without giving too much away about the story. So yeah, and to do that, like, I went walking through the bush sometimes, you know. Like, I live in Sudbury now, and fortunately, our backyard goes right out into the bush. And I still go to Wissahickon all the time, and, you know, our place, we have a cabin in Wissahickon, and that's in the bush too, essentially, right? So, yeah, like, I did that just to get the feel of that process, because you can't just walk in a straight line through the bush, you know. It's something you have to navigate, and you need some skill to actually do it. So the first part of the story is them, you know, traversing this land, trying to get to the city that they know is to the south, but not really knowing what they're going to encounter. So there's that like elements of intrigue and of potential danger. And yeah, what I had to do was like insert certain things along the way, so that it wasn't just them walking through the bush and talking amongst themselves and wondering what they're going to see and all that, right? So.
Right, the propelling of like, you know, you have to have those markers kind of, okay, why are we stopping here? Yeah. What are we talking about? Why are we moving? And so on, and, you know, and keep the action. I won't spoil it for you, but it takes a lot of skill to move a bunch of people around. You know, it's because I was talking about this with Emma Donoghue, and she said that that's why she sets all her characters in one room, so that she doesn't have to move them around. Because when you move people, you have to explain what people are seeing. So that's why I was like, wow, he's moving a lot of people through a lot of territory. So it does take a fair bit to do that. When there is a mention of Deadlands in the book, and we don't quite, I don't want to give it away, but anyways, talk to me a little bit about the Deadlands and how you imagine that. And you mentioned something about your editor kind of saying, you should talk about that.
Yeah, just like the goal to go down and get back, you mean?
Yeah. Or the, you know, why you put the Deadlands in there, and why Rick perhaps suggested you explain that a bit more.
Yeah, well, I think part of it was just to help place the reader, and to really give a goal to the characters themselves too. So what they do is it's called Moon of the Turning Leaves, because they want to get back in time for the fall time, right? They want to see if they can get to this North Shore like area where they believe they're from, and see if they can live there. And then what they'll do is go back and get everyone and come back down, right? I think, you know, they're still figuring out what time is, you know, and really it's the seasons, the natural sort of cycles that are really keeping them in step with nature, and allowing them to consider their spots on the land and what they need to do by when and so on, right? Yeah. And they're being told by the land itself about what they should do and their potential outcomes. Like, as you heard, you know, they've been fishing this lake for too much, and the fish are undergrown, and there are fewer of them, and so on, right?
Did you want to put the Deadlands in the story, or was that a suggestion? You said it was a suggestion from your editor to put that in.
Yeah, I did want to have that just for the sake of like chronology and really like, you know, as a journalist, like the facts, like have them line up that way. But Rick was really helpful in the pacing of that. Like, you know, he really helped condense the part where they're just walking and talking, right? And he said, you know, like give them hunger as, you know, a deadline in some ways, or give the weather its own force to sort of give them a goal or a deadline too at the same time, right? So yeah, I had to be totally mindful of that pace and the timing for sure. Unfortunately,
I've just been given a cue that we are getting to the end of this, and we want to save room for question and answers from Wob to your questions. So please repeat the question using a mic, which is going around. And if you could keep your questions, we'd like to get as many as we could, so fairly tight in question format, that would be fantastic.
A couple of journalists up here too, so.
down here, there actually, I see sort of, I can't quite see, but I see sort of like these like.
Thank you. I'm so happy to hear about Evan. I thought it was the going to see. So I was interested that in the book, the first book, that it seemed like it was sort of a male-driven story, and the women were sort of background players in some respects. But it seemed to me that the heroine that set them on a new path was Meg, and I just wondered how you viewed that as the writer.
Yeah, good question. Well, in the first book, like the reason you see so much through the perspective of the young men is because like they're the ones tasked with like the upkeep and the survival of everybody. So it's Evan and his two buddies, right, Isaiah and Tyler. And what exists still in the first book is this sort of patriarchal governance, through the Indian Act, and you have this male chief and so on, who's ultimately like a pretty weak leader, as we see in the story, right? So even though those guys are at the center of the action, you still have Nicole and Aileen, like the elder figure, who are essentially the spiritual foundation or pillar of the entire story. And their decisions and their actions are actually what influence the outcome and ultimately will help them survive. So even though they're not predominant in the actual narrative of the action, like that's where I see them fitting in, right? And with Meg making that decision at the end, Meg is, if you haven't read the first story, this is a major spoiler. Maybe close your ears. But like that was always going to be the outcome of Justin Scott. That was always going to be how he ended. And I had to decide who was going to do it. And like to have her do it was more or less like cleaning up your own mess kind of thing, because they came up after him, they partnered with him sort of. She breaks off obviously, and we see that scene between her and Nicole where they have that moment where they almost connect and really form that alliance. But it's Meg in the end who makes that decision, and that's why Meg is in the second story too. So thanks for that. Yeah, it was just like I was like anybody could pull the trigger, I guess, but it was more interesting for me to make her do it.
Oh, way back there? Yes? I think you're passing the mic. I think that's what's happening.
Thank you for this. As I read the first book, and I'll admit I haven't finished reading the second one yet, it struck me that you told that story without unearned optimism. There were no superheroes or miracles coming in the third act. There was no fetishized violence either. Were these conscious decisions you made as you told the story, or is it a feature of your storytelling?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you. Yeah, because I knew this with the first book, because I knew it was going to come into this genre and be discussed in that way, that there are so many tropes in that genre already of a superhero dude saving the day, right? And that's not realistic at all. That's not what's going to happen if the world collapses. It's going to be people coming together to work for survival, right? And I had that I guess revelation when the blackout of 2003 happened and I was in my home community. My brothers and I were like, okay, who can we go to for help? Who can we help? Who can do what? And so on. And it was like, okay, if this is the end of the world, we're going to be all right. So I think that's the sort of spirit that I wanted to reflect in the first book, that it's going to take a group of people to survive and not just one guy with a sawed-off shotgun, with a handsome, scruffy beard, or, but with the violence, that's I think violence is essential to a story like this, for better or worse. It has to be reflected somehow. How I chose to do it was, like in the second book, there's some pretty violent stuff, and I think it's not just to attach, like, it's not to be shocking at all, but to, I think, if I'm going to be as, like, as vivid about, like, emotion or about nature or about, you know, harvesting, you know, I got to be as vivid with the violent as well, just to keep in the same sort of format in some ways, right? But, like, there's not too much of it at the same time. So yeah, those are, you know, decisions to make while I'm going through it. But like honestly, like in a really morbid way, like the payoff from writing the violence is kind of satisfying, especially when it comes to the bad guys that you want to do in, you know. So yeah, maybe I got a little too excited about writing some of those parts, but we'll see.
I'm really sorry. I know that there's a few more hands out there, but we're going to wrap up now because Wob's going to go and sign books. I hope you have your books. And if you haven't, buy the books. You're capable of buying books, right? Okay. I'm like, wait. Yeah, and thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Judith.
Folks, thank you so much for coming to participate in this conversation between Judith Pereira and Wabashek Rice.